Somewhere between darkness and truth, there are people who vanished without a single goodbye. Welcome to the place where unsolved mysteries breathe again, where we reopen the cases time tried to bury. Some stories don't fade with time. They linger, quiet, heavy, like the echo of a voice calling from somewhere deep in the woods. And if you've ever stood alone in an American forest at dusk, you know that silence there has a weight to it, the kind that settles on your skin and makes you listen a little harder. This is the story of a young man who walked into that silence and never walked back out. On October 17, 2009, 23-year-old Evan Cole drove into the Grayson National Forest of West Virginia. He wasn't chasing danger or adventure or anything dramatic. He just needed a break. The past month had been brutal. His relationship had ended unexpectedly, and the manufacturing plant where he worked had shut down. According to his mother, Evan said he wanted a few hours to clear his head. He parked his silver pickup truck at the Pine Ridge trailhead around 1:01 p.m., a time when the forest still held onto the last warmth of the afternoon sun. A trail camera captured him minutes later. A green windbreaker, a small backpack, a half-empty bottle of water, and that expression people wear when they're trying hard to hold themselves together. Pine Ridge wasn't the kind of trail where people vanish. Families hiked it on weekends. Retirees walked their dogs there. Evan had been on this trail before, and yet, that day, something, no one knows what, pulled him farther than he planned. When he didn't return home by nightfall, his mother assumed he'd lost track of time. When midnight passed, she began calling his friends, and by sunrise, she was standing alone in the chilly morning air beside Evan's parked truck, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The official search began at 6:04 a.m. Rangers, deputies, volunteers, drones, dogs. They swept the main trail first, finding only the fading impressions of Evan's boots. His footprints continued for nearly 2 miles, and then, without warning, they stopped. No scuff marks, no signs of a struggle, no indication he had slipped, fallen, or turned back. Just an abrupt end. Experienced trackers were called in. They found a narrow, barely noticeable break in the brush leading toward a shallow creek bed, an area off-trail, not used by hikers. Near a large flat rock beside the creek, they noticed a faint slide mark, as if someone had lost their footing. But there was no blood, no clothing, no dropped items, nothing to tell them where Evan went next. That day, and in all the days that followed, search teams combed the woods, expanding their grid outward until they crossed into private land. The forest remained cold, still, and uncooperative, giving back none of the answers they begged for. And that is where the mystery truly begins, not with Evan walking into the woods, but with those final steps, the ones that vanish into a silence no one has ever been able to explain. When someone goes missing in a national forest, the first 48 hours are everything. In Evan's case, they were also the most confusing. By the morning of October 18, 2009, more than 40 people were on the ground searching: rangers, local deputies, experienced hikers, even retired firefighters from a nearby town who had come just to help. The weather was clear, the terrain familiar, and yet the search teams kept circling back with the same report. No new sign. The Pine Ridge Trail is straightforward for the first mile, but past that it breaks into several natural forks, unmarked junctions created by years of erosion and animal paths. Rangers believed Evan had followed the main fork. The footprints confirmed it, but where they stopped, the forest began to raise more questions than answers. One of the first cracks in the investigation appeared when a search team discovered something odd. A single set of tire tracks on a service road roughly half a mile from where Evan's prints had ended. The road was rarely used, mostly for maintenance trucks, and hadn't seen fresh tracks in days. But these impressions looked recent. Too recent. Deputy Mark Hopkins, a veteran officer with a reputation for being methodical, examined the tracks closely. He noted the pattern. An older model SUV, possibly a Jeep Cherokee or a Ford Explorer, but there was no way to confirm when it had been there or whether it had anything to do with Evan. Still, the location was strange, close enough to raise suspicion, but far enough from the trail that most hikers would never see it. While teams expanded the search zone, detectives began interviewing campers and locals. A couple in their 60s, Harold and Lynn Marner, told investigators they were hiking a lower ridge around 3:30 p.m. the day Evan disappeared. They didn't see him, but they reported hearing something they described as a sharp yell, like someone startled or slipping. They didn't think much of it at the time. This was a forest. People yell, kids play, dogs bark. But when the news spread, the Marners realized that sound had come from the direction where Evan's footprints ended. The detail was troubling, but still just a detail. It wasn't enough. Search dogs were brought in next. They followed Evan's scent along the main trail until they reached the same dead point the Rangers had reached. At the break in the brush leading toward the creek bed, one of the dogs hesitated, circled twice, then stopped. Handlers described it as confusion. The scent simply didn't continue. That's when investigators turned to Evan's phone records. His phone last pinged a tower on the western side of the forest at 2:11 p.m., a location that didn't match where he had been walking. The tower covered a broad area, but the direction was wrong. If Evan had moved that way, there should have been prints, or at least disturbed undergrowth, but nothing there showed any sign of him. It was the first moment investigators considered the possibility that Evan hadn't simply wandered off. Meanwhile, Evan's mom, Jennifer Cole, insisted he had no reason to run, no hidden problems, no enemies. Evan wasn't the type to spiral or disappear. His friends backed that up. They said he had been sad but functional, showing up for pickup basketball, helping his uncle with repairs, even planning a weekend fishing trip. There was nothing to justify a sudden break from his life. The more the investigators learned, the more the timeline began to feel off, like someone had rearranged the pieces just slightly, just enough so nothing fit together. By day 3, the forest was no longer treated as a simple search area. It was a scene, a place where something unexpected had happened, and the question hanging over every step was simple. If Evan didn't leave the trail on his own, then who or what made him leave it? By the 4th day of the search for Evan Cole, the investigation had moved far beyond the idea of a simple hiking accident. The forest had been combed, the dogs had been run through the same grids again and again, and every ranger who knew Pine Ridge admitted quietly that something about this case didn't behave like the usual missing hiker scenarios they'd seen over the years. That was when detectives began digging into Evan's life, his last 72 hours, his relationships, the people he argued with, the people who called him, and the ones who still couldn't account for where they were when he vanished. The timeline painted a picture the family hadn't expected. 3 nights before he disappeared, Evan had gotten into a heated argument outside a local bar with a former coworker, Troy Harland, a man known for carrying grudges longer than most. Witnesses described the exchange as tense and personal, centered around money Troy claimed Evan owed him from months earlier. The argument fizzled only when a bartender stepped outside, but detectives noticed something in Troy's later interviews: his irritation at the subject, and his difficulty proving where he was the afternoon Evan vanished. The day after the bar incident, Evan helped his uncle with fence repairs, quiet but steady. Nothing alarming. Yet on the night before he disappeared, he received a 6-minute call from an unregistered prepaid phone, one never used before and never used again. Whatever was said, Evan kept to himself. On October 17th, Evan left his house just after noon. His phone pinged near Pine Ridge just before 1 p.m., and then nothing until 2:11 p.m., when it briefly connected to a tower on the western side of the forest, a direction that didn't match the footprints he left on the trail. Detectives knew a lost hiker might wander, but the scent dogs would have picked up a drift, and the prints would have shown more confusion on the ground. Instead, the tracks stopped cleanly, abruptly, like someone had stepped off the trail with a purpose. The first serious shift in the investigation came from an unexpected source, a 17-year-old named Micah Turner, who had been camping with a friend on the lower ridge. He hesitated to come forward, but once he did, his story pulled a new thread through the case. Micah said that around late afternoon, he wasn't sure of the exact time, they heard something crashing through the brush. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too frantic. A moment later, they heard a man's voice, panicked, not forming words, but unmistakably distressed. Before they could react, they heard a single car door slam, followed by the rumble of an older engine roaring to life and tearing down a nearby service road. Micah pointed detectives toward the direction of that sound, and it matched perfectly with the location where investigators had found fresh tire tracks on a road that rarely saw traffic. While detectives processed the implications, they continued pulling apart Evan's personal relationships. His ex-girlfriend, Marissa Hale, insisted they parted amicably, but phone logs showed she had made 2 short calls to him the night before he disappeared, each only seconds long. She said they were accidental. Detective Ruiz wasn't convinced. Meanwhile, the argument with Troy Harland resurfaced in a darker light when it was confirmed that Troy had left home during the exact window of Evan's disappearance and had access to his brother's 1998 Jeep Cherokee, a dark green SUV consistent with the tire pattern on the service road. Back in the forest, searchers returned to the creek bed where Evan's footprints ended and found something overlooked in the initial sweep: a rectangular indentation in the soil beneath the rock, the size of a small notebook. Evan's mother confirmed he always carried a black notebook wherever he went. It was never found. The notion that something had fallen or been taken unsettled investigators. Combined with the unregistered phone call, the argument with Troy, the strange phone pings, the unidentified SUV, and now a witness who heard what could have been a struggle, the investigation began shifting toward an uncomfortable possibility. Evan didn't simply walk off that trail. Something or someone pulled him off it. By the end of the week, Detective Hopkins wrote a single line on the board in the command center, a line that redirected the entire case. This may not be a missing person incident. This may be an abduction. And with that, The forest stopped being the only place to search. The investigation, now sharper than ever, turned toward motives, grudges, fear, and the people who may have wanted to see Evan disappear. As October turned to November in 2009, the search for Evan Cole slowed the way forest winds die at dusk, gradually, quietly, until no one noticed the moment it stopped. For almost 3 weeks, investigators, volunteers, and family members combed Pine Ridge. They climbed ravines, dredged creek beds, checked abandoned hunting cabins, and expanded the perimeter farther than most missing hiker cases ever required. But nothing changed. No new footprints, no dropped clothing, no scent trails, no sign of a struggle except for the faint impressions in the tire tracks that led nowhere. By late December, the investigation had exhausted every angle. Troy Harland had been interviewed 8 separate times. His alibi wasn't solid, but it wasn't provably false. The Jeep he drove had no blood, no fibers, no trace of Evan. Marissa's calls were suspicious but benign. The anonymous prepaid phone yielded nothing, and Micah's account of the panicked voice and the slamming car door, though compelling, couldn't stand alone as evidence. Through winter, the case softened around the edges. Newspapers stopped printing follow-ups. The community, shaken at first, slowly folded the incident into memory, the way small towns often do. As years passed, new tragedies, new stories, new headlines pushed the disappearance of a young man in a forest into the background. Even the detectives were reassigned to new cases. The forest never gave anything back, and eventually people stopped asking it too. But Evan's mother never stopped keeping the porch light on. She never stopped believing someone knew something, and she never stopped checking the Pine Ridge trailhead each year on the anniversary just to see if anything had changed. Nothing ever did. Not until September 3rd, 2021. That morning, a group of surveyors hired for a new environmental impact study were mapping an area nearly 2 miles off any marked trail, an area that had been considered too rugged to search extensively back in 2009. One of the surveyors, a man named Daniel Pierce, spotted something pale beneath a fallen spruce. He thought it was a deer bone at first, but as he knelt down and brushed away soil, he froze. It was a human skull. The sheriff's office closed off the area within hours. Over the next 2 days, they recovered most of the remains scattered in a 12-foot radius, weathered, broken in places, but unmistakably human. In the pile, searchers found scraps of fabric that once might have been part of a jacket, a rusted metal zipper, and a single hiking boot degraded by 12 years of harsh winters. And lying half buried under leaves, almost missed entirely, was something far more important. A small, cracked black notebook, its pages stuck together with moisture, its cover nearly fused shut. DNA testing confirmed what the town already feared: the remains belonged to Evan Cole. For the first time in 12 years, the investigation reopened, not as a missing person case, but a homicide. The skeletal examination told investigators 2 things with startling clarity. Evan hadn't died from exposure or a simple fall. There were hairline fractures on the ribs consistent with blunt force. One wrist bone showed signs of a sharp twist, possibly restrained, and the way the remains were scattered suggested animal activity post-mortem, but not how he died. The notebook took months to analyze. Specialists freeze-dried it, page by fragile page. Most of the writing had dissolved into blotched ink, but a handful of entries survived. The last legible one sent a shock through investigators. He followed me again, same Jeep, Same guy. Don't know what he wants. Jeep. The word hit like an echo from 2009. It brought detectives straight back to Troy Harland. When questioned again in 2021, Troy looked older, softer around the edges, but the irritation was still there, and this time, when asked to give DNA, he refused. Investigators obtained a warrant. His DNA didn't match anything at the scene, nothing on the bone, nothing on the recovered jacket. But that wasn't the end. A deeper search into Troy's background turned up something the 2009 detectives hadn't discovered. Troy had been involved in an unreported fight weeks before Evan vanished. A fight witnessed by a teenager whose family had since moved away. A fight that happened near the very service road where the SUV tracks were found. When investigators tracked down the witness, now an adult, they confirmed the story. Troy had shoved a young man, screamed at him, and warned him to keep his mouth shut about something involving money. The witness couldn't confirm it was Evan in that fight, but the timing and location matched too closely to dismiss. Then came the turning point. In December 2021, detectives re-examined the scrap of fabric found with Evan's remains. Technology had changed dramatically since 2009. A microscopic fiber analysis revealed two foreign fibers, dark green polyester, the type used in older Jeep Cherokee seat covers. But more importantly, embedded in one of those fibers was a partial print of automotive grease mixed with a skin cell fragment. Using modern amplification methods, the lab pulled a usable DNA profile. It belonged to Troy Harland. When confronted, Troy's composure cracked. He claimed Evan attacked him first. He claimed it was a fight that went too far. He claimed he panicked, drove Evan deeper into the forest, and left him there, still moving. But the evidence told a colder story. Troy had followed Evan onto the trail. He confronted him near the creek bed. There was a struggle. Evan was injured, likely incapacitated. He was forced into the Jeep, driven off the service road, and left alone in a part of the forest so inaccessible it took 12 years to find him. In February 2022, Troy was charged with second-degree murder. He pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. Evan's family finally buried him that spring, 12 years after he left home for what was supposed to be a quiet walk to clear his mind. The forest that hid him for so long stayed silent, as forests tend to do. But the case that once faded into memory had found its ending, not through new eyes, but through time, persistence, and the one thing that outlived everything else, the truth that Evan left behind in his notebook. After Troy Harland's confession and guilty plea in February 2022, the Ridgefield community slowly began to process what had taken 12 years to uncover. For the Cole family, the legal resolution was only part of the story. Jennifer and Mark Cole spent the spring tending to Ethan's burial, a quiet ceremony in the small cemetery near their hometown. There were no headlines, no crowd of strangers, just the people who had known and loved him and the forest itself, silent in the distance. The weight of 12 lost years lingered in every gesture. The light Jennifer kept on the porch, now permanently off. The empty room in the house that no one would ever repopulate. The echoes of unanswered questions that had haunted every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary day. Detectives who had worked the case returned to their offices, many for the first time in nearly a decade, to review the file one last time. They revisited the notebook, preserved carefully in a climate-controlled archive, reading the fragments of thought and sketches that survived the elements. Specialists noted how the entries, though scant, had provided the first and final clues of Evan's torment. The repeated warnings of being followed, the anxiety encoded in shorthand, the subtle indications of fear that had gone unnoticed in 2009. It was a reminder that even the smallest traces can hold the largest truths, and that human persistence of family, of investigators, of witnesses was often the only force capable of wresting justice from time. In the months following the verdict, law enforcement held a series of debriefings, using the case as a teaching moment. They analyzed what had been missed in 2009, overlooked witness testimony, subtle inconsistencies in alibis, the significance of the service road, and the importance of modern forensic technology in cold cases. The Ridgefield Sheriff's Department implemented new procedures for preserving evidence in remote areas, logging off-trail sites more thoroughly, and maintaining open channels with families of missing persons. Ethan's disappearance, once quietly folded into the community's memory, became a benchmark for how long unsolved cases could be reopened and solved through persistence, patience, and scientific advancement. For the public, the story faded again, but in a different way. No longer a tragedy without resolution, but a cautionary tale about vigilance, about listening to small details, and about the unpredictable ways the forest can hide a life and eventually reveal it. Hikers returned to Pine Ridge and Split Cedar Ridge, unaware of the exact coordinates where a young man had vanished and where his body had finally been recovered. The creek beds, the ravines, the narrow service roads, they remained quiet, as if holding their breath. The forest, indifferent but immutable, its silence now a memorial. And for Jennifer Cole, the notebook remained the most personal artifact of all, a fragile, stained testament to the son she had loved, lost, and finally acknowledged. The pages that survived, the sketches that hinted at his thoughts, the brief words that spoke of fear and caution, they were all she had left. Yet they were enough to tell the truth, that Ethan Cole had faced a moment of mortal danger, that justice had been delayed but not denied, and that even in the vast, indifferent wilderness, human persistence, memory, and love could eventually pierce the silence. The Vanishing Trail was over, not with the sound of a gavel or a headline, but with quiet reflection, with the long arc of time bending toward truth, and with the knowledge that even the deepest shadows eventually give way to light. And in that light, the story of a young man who walked into the forest and whose memory never left it, finally found its rest. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next videos, where we continue to follow the mysteries that have never slept. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned